The night the police showed up to arrest my daughter, I felt something break inside me. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't dangerous. She was an 18-year-old girl standing on our front porch barefoot, clutching her phone with tears running down her face. And yet 2 officers moved toward her as if she were a threat to society. Why? Because our HOA decided she violated community standards. That's all it took. A petty rule twisted into a weapon, a phone call dripping with lies. And suddenly my daughter was treated like a suspect in her own home. I'll never forget the way her voice cracked when she whispered, "Dad, am I going to jail?" That moment is seared into me. My daughter, raised to follow the rules, to respect authority, now facing handcuffs because a group of self-important neighbors decided to play God. I am a Marine. I have faced war zones. I have buried brothers who never came home. But nothing prepared me for the sight of my little girl standing under those red and blue lights, shaking like a leaf. The HOA thought they could scare us into submission. They thought they could use the law as their personal hammer. But they forgot one thing. I don't scare. I don't bend. And when you come from my family, you better be ready for a fight you will not win. This was the night they picked the wrong Marine. When we first moved into that neighborhood, I thought we had found peace. After years of deployments, relocations, and cramped military housing, I wanted one thing: stability. A safe place where my daughter could finish school, make friends, and build a future without me worrying about mortar rounds or midnight alerts. The house was modest but perfect for us. A small porch where my daughter liked to read in the evenings, a patch of lawn she insisted on planting flowers in, and a flagpole out front where I proudly raised the stars and stripes every morning. But peace is fragile. It didn't take long before the letters started arriving. Violation notices, they called them. At first, they were almost laughable. My daughter had parked her car slightly angled in the driveway. Improper parking. A flower pot on the porch wasn't in the HOA approved color palette. Aesthetic disruption. I shrugged them off. I'd faced worse. Bureaucracy is nothing new to a Marine. I figured if I stayed respectful and followed the basic rules, they'd leave us alone. But the tone of those letters shifted. They weren't reminders. They were warnings. Threats disguised as policy fines for nonsense infractions. $30, $50, then $100. Each one more ridiculous than the last. My daughter tried to laugh it off. "It's just the HOA, Dad," she'd say, rolling her eyes. But I could see the way it weighed on her. Every time she walked through the neighborhood, she felt watched, judged, picked apart. Then came the first confrontation. I was trimming the hedges when a woman I'd never met strutted up to my lawn, clipboard in hand. Her voice was sharp, her tone dripping with authority she didn't have. "You can't have that flag flying past dusk," she snapped. I looked up at her, sweat dripping down my forehead, shears still in my hand. "That flag stays up," I said flatly. Her lips curled into a smirk. "Not according to the bylaws. I'll be issuing a fine." That was the first time I realized this wasn't about community. It wasn't about order. It was about control. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I kept my head down, they'd lose interest. But my daughter wasn't so lucky. One afternoon, she came home pale and shaking. "Dad, they followed me," she whispered. The HOA president himself had pulled her aside, accusing her of reckless driving because she drove a little too fast through the gate. He warned her that the board was watching her closely. My daughter, barely 18, being stalked by middle-aged neighbors drunk on fake power. That night, I sat on the porch long after she went to bed, staring at the streetlights, my fists clenched. I knew the pattern. I'd seen it overseas. Bullies testing the waters, pushing boundaries, seeing how far they could go before someone pushed back. They wanted submission, obedience, fear, but they didn't realize who they were dealing with. I faced down insurgents who hid bombs in schools. I've stared into the eyes of men who wanted nothing more than to see me dead. And I've never once given an inch. So I made a quiet vow that night. If they came after my daughter again, if they so much as breathed in her direction, I would meet them head on. And sure enough, I didn't have to wait long. The next violation notice wasn't for me, it was for her. They claimed her car, parked neatly in our driveway, was an abandoned vehicle. $100 fine, and a warning. Further violations may result in legal action. That's when I realized this wasn't petty anymore. This was war. It started with the car fine, but the HOA didn't stop there. Within a week, another notice arrived. This time, they accused my daughter of improper trash disposal. I remember the disbelief in her eyes when she showed me the letter. "Dad, I tied the bag. I put it in the bin. That's it." They claimed the lid wasn't fully secured. A technicality, another fine, $50. I watched my daughter's shoulders sag as she read it. She wasn't used to being treated like this. Like every step she took was wrong, and that was their tactic, grind her down piece by piece until she either snapped or submitted. Then came the noise complaint. "We don't throw parties. We don't blast music." But one evening, My daughter had a couple of friends over, laughing on the porch. By morning, another letter slid under the door. Disturbance of community peace, $75 fine. She cried that night, and I'll admit watching her break like that lit something inside me I can't put into words. Still, I tried reason. I called the HOA office, asked to meet with the board. I wanted to clear the air man to man. Instead, I was met with smirks and shrugs. The rules apply to everyone, the president said, tapping his pen against a stack of papers. If your daughter can't follow them, maybe this isn't the right community for your family. That's when I knew this wasn't about rules at all. It was about power, and they had decided to make an example of us, but I wasn't going to hand them victory. I started keeping records. Every notice, every fine, every detail. I photographed our trash bins, our driveway, even the porch. Evidence, proof. I thought I was ready, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived marked URGENT. It wasn't a violation notice this time. It was a legal warning. Failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in referral to collections and potential lien placement on your property. They weren't just harassing my daughter anymore. They were threatening our home. That night, I sat across the kitchen table from her. She was quiet, poking at her food, until finally she whispered, "Dad, are we going to lose the house because of me?" I reached across, gripped her hand, and looked her dead in the eyes. "Listen to me. None of this is your fault, and no one is taking this home from us, not while I'm breathing." She nodded, but I could see the fear lingering, the kind of fear no teenager should ever carry. I knew then that this was no longer about petty fines or neighborhood politics. This was about survival. The HOA wanted to scare us into selling, to break us down until we packed up and left, but they underestimated me. I spent years in the Marines learning how to fight back against stronger enemies. I learned patience, strategy, discipline, and if they wanted a war, I was prepared to give them one. Still, I needed leverage, something to hit them where it hurt. So I started digging. I pulled the HOA's bylaws, pored over every clause. I read about residents' rights, state statutes, federal protections. Night after night, I sat at that table under a single lamp, highlighting passages, making notes, and then I found it. Buried deep in the bylaws was a clause they'd overlooked. It said the HOA could not levy fines or penalties unless they followed a specific process: written notice, board approval, and resident hearing. They'd skip the hearing every single time. It was my first small victory, but I didn't celebrate because I knew once they realized I had caught them breaking their own rules, they'd strike back even harder, and I was right. The very next week, it wasn't just another fine. It wasn't another warning. It was the police. They called a community meeting like it was nothing. An ordinary Tuesday night, potluck signs on the bulletin board, a dozen folding chairs in the rec room. You'd think they'd want this to look routine, democratic. They wanted the optics. They wanted an audience. I went because I had to see it for myself. My daughter stayed home. At 18, the idea of walking into a room full of people who'd been hunting her felt like salt in a fresh wound. I walked in alone, sat at the back with my hands on my knees, and listened while they opened with the usual platitudes about neighborhood pride and keeping our standards high. Then the HOA president, the man with the clipped voice and the permanent tan, picked up the microphone and smiled like he was about to hand out awards. He read each violation aloud, one after another, like a litany. He savored the names. He savored the shame. And then she spoke. A woman I'd seen before at board meetings, neat hair, oversized sunglasses indoors, stood up and pointed her finger directly at my daughter's name on the printed list. Her tone was theatrical, venom dressed up as righteousness. "How do we know she's even a resident?" she demanded. "Maybe she's using our neighborhood as a playground. Maybe she's bringing trouble here." There was laughter from a few corners. It wasn't idle. It was eager. A hunt cheering for its prey. They called her a danger. A slip of a girl turned into a public spectacle. I could feel my heart beating in my throat as I watched the room close in on the idea of her. Faces contorted into expressions I'd seen on deployments. Calculated, predatory, waiting to see the next small cruelty. When the woman finished, she didn't stop at words. She produced a stack of photocopied complaints, anonymous notes, hastily written, accusing my daughter of things that never happened. They read them aloud, each more absurd than the last. Someone in the back clapped. Another stood to demand stricter enforcement. A few neighbors, eyes wide, nodded in agreement as if the truth had been revealed. My hands were fists in my lap. I did not speak. I do not like to escalate in public when I can strategize in private, but the room smelled like a cage snapping shut. After the meeting, the harassment didn't end. It evolved. The petty fines were a warm-up to a coordinated pressure campaign. 2 nights later, our streetlights flickered and then died for hours. A week after that, our water pressure dropped, first in the morning, then at dusk, enough to mean shorter showers, less cooking, less normal life. One morning, my daughter found the lock on the community gate jammed. She had to park blocks away and walk home through a route she used to bike alone. Sabotage, subtle and cruel. A gate that hummed and then refused to open. A sprinkler system reprogrammed so the grass flooded one driveway and left another bone dry. These weren't accidents. They were the work of people who learned how to weaponize the small things that make life livable. Neighbors who had previously volunteered to help now avoided us in the grocery aisle. Conversations stopped when we walked by. Mailboxes that once held invitations now held folded notes, folded like knives. Whispers about lawsuits, hints that our house was under review, threats disguised as community concern. I began to keep a different kind of record, not just photos or copies of fines, but logs, times the gate refused to open, the duration of water outages, photographs of the sprinkler patterns, timestamps on suspicious cars idling near our driveway. I started recording audio of confrontation attempts. I told myself I was preparing evidence, but it was also an odd comfort, proof that the world had not slipped into madness, that it was a coordinated cruelty and therefore beatable. Then came a small, unexpected win. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, slipped a note under my door. She remembered when we'd moved in, how my daughter carried boxes up the porch steps, how she'd laughed and waved from the yard. She'd been silent at the meeting, she said, because she was scared. But now she'd had enough. She wrote, found an old deed in her papers from when the neighborhood was first developed. She thought it might matter. That note was the first sliver of daylight in a room full of smoke. I took it to a lawyer I'd found through a veterans network, quiet, discreet, and good at reading between the lines. He listened without interruption as I laid out the stack of violations, the jammed gate, the water pressure drops, the anonymous notes. He looked at the logs, the photos, the recordings. He folded his hands and asked for Mrs. Alvarez's deed. When I handed it to him, he went very still. His face, the lawyer's, is not one that usually betrays surprise, but he flipped through the yellowed pages and paused. "There's something unusual in this developer's covenant," he murmured. "If this clause is what I think it is, the HOA's authority could be severely limited, maybe even void in certain enforcement actions. But I'd need to dig into the chain of title, look at recorded amendments, and check state statute application." My breath hitched like a soldier's before a long march. The word could hangs differently from is, and I felt the bottom drop away a little. This felt like a lead at the end of a long, cold tunnel, promising perhaps, but not yet proof. "Can you check it?" I asked. He nodded. "I can. If you want to move forward, I'll submit a records request, pull the HOA's minutes, and see if anyone followed their own process. If they didn't, if they fired off fines without hearings, we have leverage." Leverage. It was a military term too, the small advantage that collapses an enemy's plan. I felt a strange surge of hope, the kind that was both fragile and fierce. That night, after my daughter fell asleep, I sat on the porch and stared at the flagpole. The neighborhood hummed around us, indifferent, unaware, or perhaps complicit. I thought of every face that clapped at the meeting, every anonymous note, every jammed gate. I thought of Mrs. Alvarez and the yellow deed she'd tucked into a note like a lifeline. They had escalated. They had weaponized normalcy to erode our life one small cut at a time. But they had also shown me exactly where they were vulnerable: procedure, precedent, and paper. If a clause in an old deed could limit their power, then their arrogance might be their undoing. The lawyer said he would start digging in the morning, and for the first time since the first notice arrived, I slept with an edge of something close to hope. The next blow came in a thick cream-colored envelope. No handwritten notes this time, no petty violation slips tucked under the doormat. This was official, stamped, notarized, and dripping with arrogance. I held it in my hands at the kitchen table while my daughter sat across from me, her face pale as paper. The words blurred for her, but I read every line. According to the HOA, we had racked up excessive unpaid fines, thousands of dollars in so-called penalties. They claimed we were in default, that the neighborhood's standards demanded removal. In other words, get out or we'll take your home. My daughter's voice trembled. "Dad, they can't do that, right? Please tell me they can't." I wanted to tell her no. I wanted to promise it outright, but I'd learned in the Marines, false assurances kill morale. You tell the truth, even when it's hard. "They can try," I said, steady and calm. "But trying isn't the same as winning, and I don't lose." She nodded. though I saw the fear still burning in her eyes. From that day on, the HOA waged open war. Anonymous letters escalated into open gossip. When my daughter walked to her car, neighbors whispered loud enough for her to hear, "Troublemaker, doesn't belong here, no respect." They plastered notices on our mailbox. Final warning, last chance to comply. Legal action pending. It wasn't enforcement, it was psychological warfare. The same woman from the meeting, sunglasses perched on her nose even at dusk, caught my daughter outside one evening. She pointed a manicured finger at her and hissed, "You're ruining this neighborhood." Everyone knows it. My daughter came home sobbing. That was the moment my anger stopped simmering and started boiling. I took everything to the lawyer, the eviction notice, the fines, the harassment. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "They're overreaching," he said. "If what I saw in that deed holds up, these eviction proceedings won't survive contact with the judge. But we'll need more than defense. We need offense. Something to show the court this isn't just rule enforcement, it's abuse." He asked me to dig deeper. Financials, budgets, anything the HOA had to file publicly. So I did. It took nights of sifting through county records, online databases, and yellowed PDFs, but I found it. The HOA's financial statements. On the surface, they looked neat. Dues collected, expenses paid. But Marines learned to spot patterns, and the numbers screamed corruption. Tens of thousands allocated to landscaping, yet the grass grew patchy and brown. Maintenance costs for gates and sprinklers that broke down more than they worked, and buried in the fine print, consulting fees paid directly to the HOA president's own company. It wasn't just harassment, it was theft. I brought the documents to the lawyer. His eyes gleamed. "This," he said, tapping the page, "is fraud. If we can show they use fines as a slush fund, the whole board could crumble." For the first time, I felt the tide shift, but the HOA wasn't done. When they sensed resistance, they doubled down. One morning, my daughter found her car keyed from bumper to bumper, deep angry scratches that spelled out, "Get out." The cops came but shrugged. "Could be anyone," one said, almost bored. "Not much we can do." That night, I sat with my daughter on the porch as she tried not to cry. She kept whispering, "Why me? What did I do?" I put my arm around her. "You didn't do anything. That's why they're scared of you, because you won't break." But inside I was seething. I'd seen warlords who acted the same way, puffed up tyrants who used fear and intimidation until someone pushed back. And like those men, this HOA thought they were untouchable. They were about to learn otherwise. At the next board meeting, I stood up for the first time, not with anger, not with fists, with precision. I laid out the documents I'd uncovered, the financial discrepancies, the fraudulent expenses, the conflicts of interest. I read them aloud, my voice calm, steady, marine clear. The room went silent. Neighbors who once looked away stared wide-eyed. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The HOA president's face turned red, his smirk evaporating. He tried to cut me off, but I kept reading. Every number, every shady fee, every ounce of corruption I dug up. By the time I finished, the room was buzzing, not against me, but against them. For the first time, the HOA was on the defensive, and for the first time, I saw it in their eyes. Fear. The lawyer called me on a Wednesday afternoon. His voice was calm, but I could hear the electricity beneath it. "I've gone through the deed chain," he said. "You're not going to believe this." I closed the door to my study, notebook already in hand. "Talk to me." The HOA has been operating under amended bylaws that were never legally filed. According to the original covenant, the one filed with the county, they don't have the authority to levy fines the way they've been doing. At all, I stopped breathing for a second. "You're saying everything they hit us with, every violation, every dollar, is unenforceable," he finished. "They've been bluffing for years, hoping no one noticed. You could not only wipe out your fines, but you could expose them to liability for every resident they bullied." I sat down slowly, the weight of it pressing into me. All those sleepless nights, all my daughter's tears, all the humiliation, none of it had ever been valid. "Then we fight," I said. My voice was steady, quiet, but sharp enough to cut steel. Word spread fast. It always does in tight communities, especially ones infected with fear. Neighbors who once whispered about us now knocked on my door, cautiously at first, then with urgency. They'd all been hit with fines. Some had paid thousands. Others had been threatened with liens. One couple confessed they'd sold their house under pressure, believing they had no choice. And now, with proof in hand, They saw light for the first time. My daughter watched it unfold in awe. Where once she'd been the target of gossip, she now saw neighbors offering quiet nods of support, even smiles. It wasn't open rebellion yet, but the cracks were spreading. The HOA board felt it too. Their smug confidence at meetings had thinned into brittle defensiveness. Their words no longer carried weight. They carried desperation. Desperation makes people dangerous. Late one Friday, just as the sun slipped below the rooftops, there was a knock at our door. 2 police officers stood on the porch. My daughter froze, every muscle in her body tensed, reliving that first night. One officer cleared his throat. "We received a report of underage drinking at this residence." I almost laughed. A bitter, humorless sound. My daughter had just returned from volunteering at the animal shelter. She never touched a drop of alcohol in her life. I invited them in, calm but firm. Search the place. Every room, every corner. You won't find a thing they did, and of course they came up empty. The younger officer looked embarrassed. "Sorry, sir. We have to follow up on calls." When they left, my daughter collapsed onto the couch, hands shaking. "They're never going to stop, are they?" I sat beside her, put an arm around her shoulders. "Oh, they'll stop. Because I'm about to end this. That false police call was their final mistake. They'd crossed from harassment into criminal false reporting. And that, combined with the fraud in the deed, was enough to build a case so strong it would shatter them." The lawyer and I worked late into the nights. Every violation notice, every fine, every photograph, every log entry, all organized into binders thick enough to break a table leg. He prepped me for testimony. He prepped my daughter too, though she trembled at the thought of standing before a judge. I told her the truth. Courage is in the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite it. When the court date was finally set, the HOA tried one more stunt. They posted notices around the neighborhood, warning residents that legal action against disruptive parties was underway, implying anyone who supported us would be dragged into court. Instead of scaring people, it backfired. More neighbors approached me quietly, some handing me old letters, others offering to testify about the harassment they'd endured. The very community the HOA had ruled through fear was now turning against them. The night before court, I stood on my porch and raised the flag one more time. The stars and stripes rippled in the evening breeze, golden light catching the fabric. My daughter stood beside me. She looked older somehow, not in years, but in strength. What had once broken her spirit had now forged her steel. "Dad," she said softly, "what if they win?" I looked at her, then back at the flag. "Then we fight again. But I don't plan on losing. Not tomorrow. Not ever." Inside, the binder sat packed and ready. Evidence, truth, proof. Tomorrow the battlefield wouldn't be sand or stone, it would be a courtroom. But the mission was the same: defend the innocent, expose the tyrants, and hold the line. The HOA thought they could use power to crush us. Tomorrow, they'd learn what real power looks like. The power of truth, the law, and a Marine who refuses to back down. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse felt colder than the air outside. My daughter walked beside me, clutching a folder she didn't really need to carry, but it gave her something to hold on to. Her shoulders were squared, her chin lifted, but I could feel the tremor in her steps. I put a hand on her shoulder. "Remember, we don't have to win their approval. We just have to tell the truth." Inside, the HOA board sat together like a flock of vultures, suits too sharp, smiles too smug. The president leaned back in his chair with his arms folded, whispering something to his attorney. He caught my eye and smirked, like he already owned the outcome. I'd seen that look before, overseas, in warlords who thought money and fear made them invincible. The higher they perch, the harder they fall. The HOA's lawyer rose first, crisp suit, voice smooth as oil. He painted us as disruptive residents, habitual violators, freeloaders refusing to uphold community standards. He rattled off fines, cited bylaws, and waved papers like they were holy writ. When he finished, the president actually nodded at the judge, as if the gavel was already swinging his way. My daughter's eyes darted to me. I gave her the same look I used to give my men before patrol. Steady, calm, we're ready. My lawyer stood. No theatrics, no raised voice, just quiet authority. "Your Honor," he began, "what the HOA has presented sounds compelling until you examine the facts. And the facts tell a very different story." He laid the foundation slowly. "The bylaws, the covenant, the deed." He pointed to the missing filings, the absence of proper hearings, the legal requirement for due process the HOA had ignored again and again. Every fine they levied was procedurally defective. Every dollar they threatened to collect was based on authority they simply did not have. The judge leaned forward. The first crack in the board's confidence appeared. Then the financial records came out. Page by page, line by line, my lawyer explained how dues and fines funneled into the president's personal company, landscaping contracts with no landscapers, maintenance charges for gates that still broke down weekly, consulting fees that had no receipts. "This isn't enforcement," he said, holding up one sheet like a blade. "This is embezzlement." The courtroom murmured. Neighbors filled the benches in the back, and I saw heads shaking, eyes narrowing. Truth spreads fast when spoken aloud under oath. The HOA president shifted in his chair, sweat beginning to bead along his hairline. The judge called for a brief recess. That's when the sheriff, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor," he said, "my office has received multiple calls to the plaintiff's residence, all initiated by HOA board members. Each time the claims were unfounded. In one case, a false report of underage drinking led officers to search the home with no evidence." The judge's eyes darkened. "False police reports?" The sheriff nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We're investigating potential criminal charges tied to harassment and misuse of emergency services." That was the moment the tide broke. Then came my daughter's turn. She stood, hands trembling, but her voice steady as she described being followed, singled out, humiliated at meetings, her car vandalized, her home turned into a target. "I'm not perfect," she said, voice cracking, "but I've never broken the law. I've never hurt anyone. I just wanted to live in peace, and they treated me like a criminal for existing." Her words cut deeper than any statute. I saw neighbors in the gallery wipe their eyes. Even the judge's expression softened. When it was the HOA president's turn to testify, he tried to bluster. He claimed misunderstandings, blamed clerical errors, insisted fines were necessary for order. But each answer tied a noose tighter. My lawyer pressed him on the fraudulent expenses. He stammered. The judge pressed him on the false filings. He deflected. Finally, in frustration, he snapped, "This is our community. We make the rules." Silence fell like a hammer. The judge leaned forward, voice icy. "No, sir. The law makes the rules, and you have broken them." The ruling was swift and devastating. All fines against my family nullified, all eviction proceedings dismissed. The HOA, found in violation of its own covenant, its amended bylaws declared invalid. The president, referred for criminal investigation over financial misconduct and false reporting. Neighbors in the gallery broke into applause before the gavel even fell. The sheriff didn't stop them, neither did I. My daughter squeezed my hand so hard it hurt, tears streaming down her face, not from fear this time, but from relief, from vindication. As we walked out of that courthouse, the sun felt brighter than it had in months. Neighbors approached, thanking us, promising to support any petition to dissolve the board and rebuild the association the right way. For once, my daughter wasn't the target of whispers. She was the symbol of resistance. I looked at her and said quietly, "Told you, kid. We don't lose." She smiled through her tears. "Not with you, Dad." The following weeks felt like stepping out of a storm and finally breathing fresh air. The eviction threat vanished like smoke. Every bogus fine, every violation, every scrap of paper they had shoved at us was officially void. The collection agencies stopped calling. The mailbox no longer carried poison. For the first time in months, I could walk up the driveway without bracing for another attack. But the real victory wasn't just legal. It was visible every day in the way my daughter carried herself. She didn't flinch when cars slowed near the house anymore. She didn't rush inside when neighbors walked by. She stood taller, smiled easier, her laughter filling the porch again. The same porch where months earlier she had cried over violation slips was now a place of peace again. The HOA board, stripped of authority, collapsed almost overnight. The president resigned under investigation, his smug grin gone. Other board members scattered like rats from a sinking ship. Some tried to apologize. Others hid behind silence. But it didn't matter. The fear they once wielded so casually had turned on them, and the community finally saw the truth. A new group of neighbors formed a committee, this time transparent, accountable, and bound by law. Real community, not tyranny. People talked about audits, about protecting residents' rights. For the first time since we'd moved in, the word neighborhood actually meant something. One evening, I found my daughter sitting on the porch steps, watching the flag flutter against the sunset. "You okay, kid?" I asked. She smiled, calm and certain. "Yeah, I feel safe again." I didn't think that was possible. I sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sky shift from gold to deep blue. "You know," I said, The Marines taught me a lot about fighting battles, but you taught me something bigger. She tilted her head. What's that? That some fights aren't about winning ground. They're about protecting the people you love, and no matter how hard it gets, that's a fight worth taking on. She leaned against me, and for the first time in a long time, silence felt like peace instead of tension. The HOA had tried to break us. Instead, they forged us stronger. And now, our home was truly ours again. At the end of it all, the HOA thought they could bully a teenager into silence. They thought they could break a family with fines, threats, and fear. But what they didn't count on was a father who'd been trained never to back down, never to surrender, and never to let his loved ones face a battle alone. Justice wasn't fast and it wasn't easy. It came one sleepless night, one record kept, one truth revealed at a time. But when it finally arrived, it was absolute. The board that once strutted with power was stripped bare in front of everyone. Their lies exposed, their authority dissolved, their smugness crushed under the weight of the very laws they ignored. My daughter walked out of that courtroom free, not just free from fines, but free from the shadow that had hung over her every step. She learned that courage doesn't mean you don't cry or that you don't fear. It means you stand anyway. And together we stood. So if there's a lesson in all this, it's simple. Bullies only win if you let them. Whether it's in a schoolyard, a workplace, or an HOA boardroom, the moment someone stands tall and says no more, their power crumbles. And now I want to ask you, what would you have done if someone tried to arrest your child over a fake HOA rule? Would you have stood up even if it meant going to war with your own neighborhood? If you want to hear more stories of justice, payback, and standing up against abuse of power, make sure you follow, subscribe, and come back for the next chapter. Because trust me, I've got plenty more to tell.